the special meeting of the Board of Education for Wednesday, July 17th. All board members are present and accounted for. And with that, we'll move on to the pledge, which will be led by our newest member, Mother Espinoza.
Right hand over your heart and ready to begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Melissa. And did we receive any requests for public comment?
No.
Okay, so we have no public comment requests. With that, we'll move on. We have really no action for today's meeting other than to learn. And so with us today is Sue Ann Solomon Evans from Dennis, Wolver, and Killy, and she's going to conduct the governance workshop on the Brown Act. So it's all up to you now at this point. For the record, I have a surgical procedure this afternoon, and I will need to leave here about 10:30. So when you see me get up and walk out, Donna's in charge.
And I will not think that you would just had it with this training. Well, I'll tell you, I have heard a lot of complaints from board members about the Brown Act. It's just so constricting on our ability to have conversations and have meaningful dialogue. So we'll talk about where it comes from and why it's in place. And that can actually help learning about it, can help you maneuver through it so that you can have meaningful conversations in the way that the law intends. Let's get started. We're actually going to talk about more than just the Brown Act. We're going to start with the role of the board, and that stems from both the Education Code and your own bylaws. How many of you have reviewed your bylaws recently? Right, wow, all right. How many of you have had Brown Act training before? Okay. Then we're going to cover a little bit of conflict of interest. Now, conflict of interest could be a whole presentation on its own because it has a lot of ins and outs. But the intention here is just to kind of get you thinking about when a conflict might arise. What are the circumstances and what is the law really looking at in terms of conflicts? And then we'll get into the Brown Act and with a little bit of detail. What is a meeting? The agenda requirements? What are the public's rights when they come to a meeting? Closed sessions, which are a little tricky. And then violations. What happens if there's a violation? What are the consequences there? And then we have a true or false. Get to test the testers, the educators. And I definitely want this to be, a back and forth. Please feel free to ask any questions as we're going along. We have 3 hours to cover the materials, and this really needs to be geared towards what your issues are. What are the concerns you have as you're trying to work through these various laws that govern? So role of the board. We have the Education Code, and you have your board policies, which change pretty frequently, right? CSBA seems to be constantly coming up with changes for us. And then your bylaws. Now, Ed Code is pretty great when it comes to the board. 35160 is what we call the permissive code. And it actually may be kind of buried in the Ed Code that's this thick, but it gives you a great deal of discretion. It says, boards, you are free to carry out any program that or act that you would like to do, so long as it's not inconsistent with the law as set forth in the Education Code or otherwise applicable to the school district. So you get a lot of benefit from that because what stems from discretion are also protections in a liability setting. So it's important to remember that you have discretion. Somebody makes a challenge on the legal front, often you'll be able to say, hey, we're a board with discretion, we considered options, we exercise discretion, and we're protected, we're immune from liability. But what's important about that is the concept of a board, right, and acting as a board. You're all individual board members with important roles as individuals, but your actions and those protections that go with those actions come to you when you operate as a board. So no one board member is authorized to make a representation on behalf of the board, to bind the board to some kind of agreement. We can talk about when that might happen with the board president, for example, or if the board authorizes an individual to make a public statement or otherwise represent the board as a whole. But just, I'm a board member and I've decided this is really important and I'm gonna represent on behalf of the board that this is what we're gonna do. That's where the line is crossed. So again, we operate as a unit. The actions that you take as a board that are reflected in your minutes are your board actions. It doesn't mean that actions you might take in closed session aren't board actions. It's just they get reflected in the minutes sometimes in a different way. And we'll talk about that when we talk about closed sessions. Bless you. So we mentioned the protections, the immunities. Again, you can lose that if you step outside your board role. And it's also, I get this question a lot about board members, whether they're employees or they have some of the employment rights. They're not. You're public officials. You've been elected to hold this important role, so you're distinct from employees. Any questions about any of that? No. So then Temple City, your district has a lot of board policies and board bylaws. And again, the bylaws are really about how you operate as a board. And some of the specifics on the role of the board are in 9000, 9005, and 9200. And there are others, of course, throughout, but we don't have the time to go through all of it. Role of the board. This is what you all have decided, really, and adopted as your role. That you're elected by the community to provide leadership. Right? You're to ensure that the district is responsive to your community in your elected capacity, to their values, beliefs, and priorities. That's interesting, right? It's pretty broad. Then we get to 9005 and we start to kind of narrow things down. We understand that we have commitments to our community, that the students are first and foremost, that we're going to comply with the laws, and to maximize board effectiveness and public confidence in district governance. Board members are expected to govern responsibly and hold themselves to the highest standards of ethical conduct. All right, that's like one of these, okay, are we all in? We're going to meet these really, these are very high standards, right? And as they should be. The board expects its members to work with each other and the superintendent to ensure a high-quality education. And that doesn't mean you are always going to agree on what that means, but when you work as a group and you have a majority setting a policy or a direction, it is expected that the board come together to support that. It doesn't mean you have to agree with it, but that is the idea that once we've decided as a majority we're going to collectively support the district and the superintendent as she moves forward to implement the direction of the board.
Bless you.
Keep learning and achievement for all students. That's your #1 priority. Value, support, advocate for public education. Recognize and respect differences of perspective and style on the board and among staff, students, parents, and community. To the point that we're not all going to engage in the same way, but we're all going to be sensitive to how we engage with each other and understand that we are a team. Act with dignity and understand implications of demeanor and behavior. Keep confidential matters confidential. And we'll talk about that a little bit in closed session, but that expands to things like employee information and student information. There's a lot of confidentiality that you have access to, confidential information. And participate in professional development and commit the time and energy necessary to be an informed, effective leader. So thank you. Today you are doing exactly that. And I appreciate the opportunity to work with you on it. Now, limitations of board member authority. We've kind of covered it, but I wanted you to see that it's in your bylaws as 9,200, unless agreed by the board as a whole. Individual members are not to exercise administrative responsibility. They're not to sort of take on the role of an employee, but instead bring concerns, bring issues to the superintendent, and then the superintendent at her discretion can refer the request to the entire board. So if you have a concern, the idea is you come to your superintendent, and then that can either be addressed through working with the superintendent, or maybe it's something that the whole board needs to consider, and it will be put on an agenda for a meeting. Again, you don't have individual authority to resolve complaints. If you're approached by somebody, and this happens a lot, right? You're in the grocery store, and somebody says, oh, this teacher, and oh my gosh, and what are you going to do about it? And sometimes you just need something to be able to say and be prepared for that. I hear you, and either refer that person to the district administration, or say, I'm going to raise this to the superintendent. And then they feel heard, but at the same time, you're not taking on something where you're stepping outside your role as a board member. Any questions about role of the board? Okay, so we'll move on to conflicts of interest. And I got a question before we started whether this just applies to school districts. It doesn't. It applies to all public officials and elected officials, as well as certain members of your administration, your higher level decision-making individuals.
I'm sorry, I had a question about the previous
Sure.
section. So on the topic of, let's say a person comes to you as a board member and raises a concern, you say, hey, I'll take that to the superintendent. Is it the board's role, is it appropriate for a board member to then understand what the outcome of that is?
I think that's very fair. The distinction is that you're not working it through or making representations about how it will be handled. You're simply taking that information and then passing it on to the administration for them to handle. And you can absolutely work with the superintendent to say, hey, remember that issue with so-and-so? Did anything come of that? How did that resolve? And have a conversation, but I wouldn't think that you would then take that information and share it back to whoever that individual was. I think instead what you do is, if they call you again and they're dissatisfied, something like that, say, gosh, and they're not really, like the State Board of Education, for example. Isn't that interesting? They're subject to the Bagley-Keene Act. Yet all of the districts that operate under them are subject to the Brown Act. They make the distinction based on state agencies versus local districts or local agencies. So here's to your point, to your question. What's a legislative body? It includes commission, committees, the board, whether permanent or temporary, and we'll get into this a little bit, decision-making or advisory established by charter, ordinance, resolution, or formal action of the board. Well, that makes it sound like everything is covered, right? Any committee you might have. That's not the case. If the committee is created by staff, so your superintendent says, I really need a budget committee, then that's not going to be subject to the Brown Act, unless there's a quorum of the board. So for your board, your quorum is 3, so that would prohibit any more than 2 members from serving on that kind of committee. If you have 3 members, then you're definitely subject to the Brown Act and have to do the full postings. And it's very unusual to have a committee of the majority of the board. If the committees are created by the board, they're subject to the Brown Act, unless they're ad hoc and their membership is less than a quorum. Okay, let's break that down. Let's say the board says, we've got this interesting issue on what we should do with this building. This extra building that all districts have, right? What should we do with it? Let's get a study group together and have them consider what some options are and bring that back to the board as a whole. So in that case, you are choosing 2 board members, but this is a committee that, or commission, whatever you want to call it, that's being created by the board as a whole. So that is going to be subject to the Brown Act. Now, what we did recently was an interesting kind of combination of things. We wanted to have a committee to address a very specific community issue. It was not going to be a long-term committee, something like 6 months. Wanted it to be with 2 board members, but under the circumstances, it wasn't going to be a Brown Act compliant committee because there was a lot of private conversation that needed to happen with that, with an opposing, quote-unquote, opposing party. There were just implications for making it Brown Act compliant. So how did that happen? Well, what we did was, we said this is an ad hoc committee. It's for this limited purpose. It's for this limited period of time. It's not established by the board, but the board did approve a resolution saying those things. So when somebody would complain or the DA would raise a question, that's who enforces the Brown Act. It would point to, this is the intention of the board, that the board is, even though we took action around this committee, our action was to adopt a resolution making clear that this is an ad hoc committee and not any kind of permanent or other committee subject to the Brown Act. So the question around did the board create the committee is important for whether it's Brown Act or not. And there are lots of ways to document that you didn't create it, even though you may have input or say about its existence. So that's how we handled that. You have lots of committees. You probably do have, your LCAP advisory committee. Your ELAC is going to be subject to Brown Act. School site councils, school advisory committees. If you have a migrant education parent advisory council, and then this one's great. Pre-1979 parent advisory committees and school site councils. I don't know if you have any of those that have just kept going since 1979, because laws have changed a lot since that point in terms of school site councils and things. But
so there is no limited committee that is not subject to the Brown Act if it was created by the board, is that what you're saying?
That's right, that's right. If it's created by the board, then it's going to be subject to the Brown Act. If it's acknowledged by the board but not created, and then at that point, it's determined to be an ad hoc committee. And again, it also has to be for a limited purpose and a limited period of time. You can't have some kind of long-standing committee that avoids the Brown Act by just saying, oh, we didn't do that. Because again, the intention is to be as transparent as possible when you're conducting the district's business, all aspects of the district's business, even those things that the board members may not participate in on a regular basis. So a meeting, this one is always kind of interesting. What's a meeting? Well, this is a meeting, right? We know what a meeting looks like. We can figure that out. Well, the Brown Act makes it harder than that, right? It's really any time you all get together, a majority of you get together to hear, discuss, or deliberate on an item that is within the subject matter that is within your jurisdiction. There are certainly exceptions. We'll talk about those. But this applies, you can create a meeting without ever taking any action. 3 of you run into each other at that same market where all your community hangs out asking you questions. And you're like, oh, did you hear about the thing that happened in the district office? Oh yeah, I'm really upset about that. I'm super upset about it too. We should do this. I think that's a great idea. What have we just done? That's a meeting, right? So you've deliberated, you've discussed, you've heard from the majority of your board, you just had a meeting. You didn't take any action, you didn't decide what you were going to do necessarily, but it's still a problem. Well, that one's actually pretty straightforward. We can recognize that when it's happening. Again, meetings are about location and logistics, but they're also about conversations. Your meetings, let's just talk about access, right? You know your meetings have to be accessible to the public, non-discriminatory. You need to make available any kind of assistance that might be available for disabled to meaningfully participate in your meetings. And they have to occur within your district boundaries. Did that surprise anybody when you became a board member? No? You know, in charter school land, they don't really have boundaries the way districts do. So they contend that under the Brown Act they can meet anywhere in the state. And there's been a lot of pushback on that because, again, the fundamental idea is that you are available to the public that you serve and where people are located, and so they can come and meet and hear you meet. But you can go outside the district boundaries to comply with a court order. Let's hope you're not having to do that. To look at real property, personal property. I know you certainly can go to Sacramento. Do you all go to Sacramento? Sometimes that's done as a team to go up and advocate for the district and the interests of your students. That is certainly available to you. And to participate in meetings of multi-agency significance. So if you all decide that it's important to be at the city council because they're going to discuss something that implicates the district, you are free to go to that meeting. We'll talk about the difference if you're going to actually go to have some kind of a joint meeting where you're going to engage with the city on something that is related to the school district, then you would actually post for the Brown Act the same way that the city posts for its meetings. So you have these two agendas posted, and then you can go and have full deliberation discussions.
This actually brought up a thought.
Yeah.
So this trainings, this what do we call them, the board trainings, if all the members of the board are attending, and they are together,
Yes.
so they just can't talk about specific, even if like the topic comes up and you're like, oh, that topic on this subject in our district, is there limits there?
We'll talk about that because that is real, right? You all go to CSBA.
That's CSBA.
Yeah, exactly. So you're in these conferences where you're thinking about your district, these issues that you're learning about impact your district. So we'll definitely talk about that, and when that's a problem and when it's not. But let's cover teleconference really quickly. Do you all do teleconference occasionally? Yeah, sometimes that has to happen. It still has to be open to the public. And one thing that folks don't always realize is that when it's agendized, wherever the board member is going to be, that has to be posted on the agenda as well. The board member, wherever they might be, the Hilton in Utah, they have to post as well. They have to post, and they have to make the space available to the public. Now you're nodding like maybe you've been through that process before. I don't know of anybody that has ever had somebody actually come in, but we have said if you're in your hotel room, you post it, you open your door. It sounds crazy, but that's what the expectation is. That way, it's not just that they can come into your room, right, member of the public, but they need to be able to participate in the meeting. So you have your cell phone, you put it on conference, right? Or not conference, but speaker. So they can participate in that way. And the majority of your board still has to be within the district boundaries. So we can't all go on vacation at the same time.
You just can't have a meeting.
Yeah, exactly. Just no meeting that way. That's right. And then when you have a teleconference, you have to do a roll call vote, right? So that it's specifically announced. And that's more common now than it used to be, just on generally on votes, that each vote is a roll call vote. The agenda should indicate how, if the meeting will proceed, and if the meeting will proceed if technical problems prevent teleconferencing. So if some glitch and your phone's out of battery, I don't know, then you have two options. You can cancel the meeting, or if you still have a quorum, you can continue with your meeting without the participation of the board member who isn't able to meet all of these teleconference requirements. All right, back to, I think this will get to your questions about when we're having a meeting and when we're not.
I'm sorry, your mic's not on.
Oh, I feel like I'm so loud. Hopefully you can hear me fine. So a meeting excludes the appearance of a majority of the board at a general conference that's open to the public, involving a discussion of broad issues and attended by a broad spectrum of officials from a variety of governmental agencies. When I say variety of governmental agencies, it doesn't mean different kinds of agencies. So I'm going to use CSBA as the example. It's attended by officials from districts all over the state. Those presentations that you see, you may have all of your board members wanting to see the same budget, super interesting budget one, right? You can do that because it's not based on your district. It's a broad, general discussion. But what you don't do is then walk out and start talking about, the majority of you start talking about, wow, that budget presentation was amazing. We need to do X, Y, and Z, right? Can't do that because then you do start having a meeting without that whole general conference protection. Attendance at open and publicized meetings. So that means you can go to your city council meetings. What you wouldn't do is the same thing, is start having conversations about, as a majority, about how that impacts what's going on in the district and what this board should do about it. But you can go to hear and learn. What you can't do is discuss or debate until you're in a meeting. You can certainly agendize anything you want to agendize, as long as it's within the subject matter of your district. Individual contacts and conversations. So you can certainly talk one-on-one, right? You can have, even with 3 people, 3 a majority of your board, I'll see you at CSBA and say, hey, how's it going? Oh, great, you know, my daughter's doing great in school, she's got this job. That has nothing to do with anything that you all handle as your business. So it's just a social connection. Those are not subject to Brown Act, and that doesn't create a meeting if you're all listening and jabber on about my children. And then social or ceremonial occasions. You can certainly go and participate. Again, though, you just keep in the back of your mind, you know, this great ceremony's going on, but then all of a sudden you've sort of migrated to the corner and start talking about things going on at the district, right? That's where the line is crossed, so.
And I'm assuming in this topic, the perception, that common law thing you talked about comes into play, right? What do people think you're talking about?
Well, that's a really good point, because it's not a common law appearance of impropriety in the sense of a conflict of interest, but again, transparency is the idea, and that should be exhibited, right? So if you've created a situation that looks like you're having some kind of improper conversation, that can lead to a complaint to the DA, and then you're just defending yourself unnecessarily, right? And I've seen that happen, where there was a dinner, a social dinner, and that happens at CSBA, right? This is just purely social, there's no discussion about district business, but that isn't clear to whoever's making the complaint. So yes, I would definitely recommend you keep that in mind. And CSBA is coming up not too long. Well, it's months, but it feels close. So we've covered this, but here it is, post it. For any of these exclusions we've just talked about, you just can't have discussion on the subject matter of the district, other than as part of the scheduled program. So I think this goes back to your question. I presented on the Brown Act at CSBA and get a question, hey, this is what happened in my district. And there are other board members there. That's not a problem. You can do that. I'm not giving you, in that situation, the speaker isn't giving you specific advice, right? You're, as a group, hearing it, but you're not discussing and deliberating about it. If you ask a question, I say something, and then you ask a follow-up question, and then all of a sudden you are kind of having a discussion or deliberation on the topic, that's where we might cross the line. You still have this exception, but it's to your point. You don't want to put yourself in a situation where you have to defend what you've been doing because somebody either doesn't understand the Brown Act well, or there's some appearance that you have to defend. I actually don't see a lot of full majority of board members in a particular CSBA workshop. It doesn't mean you can't do it. I just haven't noticed that a lot. And I don't know every board member across the state of California. So, so it could be happening and I'm just not knowing. Now this is one this is where it really gets tricky. A majority of the board cannot have a series of communications of any kind, directly or through intermediaries, to discuss, deliberate, or take action. Well, that seems simple enough. But before you know it, in the real world of text and email and blogs and the grocery store, all of a sudden, you've inadvertently misstepped in this area. So it's really important to keep it in mind. Doesn't mean you can never talk to another board member outside of a meeting. You certainly can. You can have a conversation with another board member about something that's on the agenda. But what you can't do is then share that information with another board member. Or say, hey, Dr. Crooker, I'm on this page and so is so-and-so. Where are the rest of the board members on this? Because then Dr. Crooker is the hub and is creating a series of communications, right? She would never do that. But that's how that can happen without really thinking about it. You're just having a conversation, you're like, well, what do they think? That's a perfectly harmless question, except that we're operating under the Brown Act, and the Brown Act makes it tricky.
Sue-Ann,
Yes.
as individual board members, we are, we get communications from potential intermediaries all the time
Yes.
with concerns.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, the best practice, I would say, if you could validate this, is to direct that person back to the superintendent. As
That's
opposed
right.
to say, to hear what they're saying, they might share, oh, another board member said this.
Right.
If we hear that, our spidey senses should go off.
Your spidey senses. Anytime you get an email or communication directed to the full board, which I know community does like to do, I want my board to know what I think about this. If you do a forward or reply all and take off being an original sender, then all of a sudden you're into Brown Act violation territory. So exactly to your point, you forward it to the superintendent. Superintendent might get one from each of the board members, but then it's up to the superintendent to process that complaint or whatever the issue is. Now, superintendent works with board president to establish the agenda and something that comes to the full board that gets forwarded to the superintendent may be an agenda item that the full board should consider. And an individual board member can ask the superintendent for that. I think this should go on the board, on the agenda. But it's up to the superintendent and the board president to establish the agenda.
And just to your point, I just want to add on, sometimes a community member will inadvertently know multiple board members
Yes.
and have the same conversation with
Ah,
more than two,
right.
possibly three
Mm-hmm.
board members, and in that case, same thing, all that information, question directed to the superintendent,
Directed.
and then I will
That's
make
right.
that communication up.
And what you can do in that situation when this person brings something forward to you, as soon as they either, I don't know if it's telephone calls or text or whatever, start to say what somebody else thinks, you can say, I'm not allowed, I'm texting, not allowed to have that discussion with you, but I look forward to the board considering this on a future agenda, something like that. Or you should work with our superintendent, she's very responsive to concerns. But it's definitely fair and appropriate to let the public know, they don't necessarily know how this all works, right? That you are under restrictions by state law on what you can communicate and even what you can hear. So we've had, what did I do?
One over.
Oh, there. If I X out of that, it's gonna.
No, just minimize that.
Okay.
So Suann,
Yes.
would it be wise to
Make sure you
have
put your mics on.
the district vote? Thanks for the reminder. I thought I was using my teacher's voice. Okay. So would it be wise for any communication that the superintendent sends out where in the email form where individual board members are BCC'd as opposed to just in the to
Mhm.
field?
What I would do is not BCC the board, but instead respond to the individual and then forward that response onto the board. And, we typically send a, don't forget, no reply all. I don't know if you ever get those on your emails, but it is a nice reminder as you get down to the end of the email, like, oh yeah, I can't talk about this. But that way, it doesn't even appear, well, you said BCC, but it wouldn't appear even to the person who's receiving the email that the board is involved with. Because part of this is certainly you need to be responsive to your community, but as we talked about in the role of the board section, we need to support our superintendent. And when something falls within her purview, then, of course people are going to talk to you about that, about those issues, but it's appropriate to say, we've referred that to the superintendent, and I know she has that information. So even if you're getting copied on something, it can lend itself to the idea that this is a board issue rather than an administration issue. Does that make sense?
Yes, and maybe later, I don't know, we're going to touch upon the San Jose decision on the PRA.
PRA.
Right, and what's discoverable electronically.
Yeah, so it's tricky because under the California Public Records Act, we have all our district records are subject to disclosure. That's the baseline. Where it gets tricky is what is a district record, and does it fall within a protection that makes it otherwise not discoverable, like an attorney-client privilege. I send memos to clients. I send emails to clients. I'll ask the superintendent to put a memo in a Friday packet. Does that make it discoverable? No. It's being delivered to the majority of the board, which we'll talk about triggers, making it available to the public, but it's exempt from disclosure because of the attorney-client privilege. So when it comes to communications, they have to be about district business. And just because it's on your personal device doesn't mean it's excluded or included. So the question still becomes, is it a district record? So if you've emailed your wife on your private device that you're going to be at a board meeting really late, is that a district record? In some way, it has a connection to your work here. On the other hand, it's not the kind of record that the district would keep as a business record. That's part of the analysis. And you probably have some privilege with your wife, so we'll recognize that for purposes of the Public Record Act. So that's the kind of thing that we would treat as personal rather than a district record. But it's tough because you have to do the analysis every time. It's so case by case. Yeah.
Is the taping of this considered public record?
It is public record. Now, there's a couple of ways that it can be made available to the public. It depends on, I don't know what your policy is on the videos, but they can either come and view the video at the district office, or they can purchase a copy of the video. But yeah, it's fix my hair, I just available to the public. All right, so, gosh, does anybody even have a fax anymore? Right?
Government.
It's so funny how things change. It's taken a long time, and the San Jose case is an example of that, how it's taken a while for the law to catch up to this whole new way of communication that we have now. So I think we've covered these points. Yeah. So again, this is just sort of emphasizing the point that you can talk to people. You just can't talk to people who, and give them your position on something that they would then go and share with somebody else. So for that individual that you know is contacting you to kind of get a feel for where the board is, or just be circumspect about what you can share, because you don't want to cross that line of having indicated, you might indicate what you think generally about something, but getting into the detail. The idea is that you come together as a board, talk about this, right? You work as a unit. So you may individually be thinking, I really think that building should be a new gym. But then you come to the board meeting and you all deliberate and discuss, and what a great idea to lease it for special education purposes to the county. I mean, you know, you could change your mind. So it's that open deliberation and working together is where you come to decisions. So we're just careful with what we share on an individual basis. So private briefings. This is again, it's the same thing, right? I really want to meet with the superintendent and get an update on that building. And so I'm going to set a meeting with Dr. Fricker and talk about what I think that meeting, or that building should look like and how it should be used. That is perfectly appropriate. You may even have kind of standing meetings with your superintendent as individuals. But what then doesn't happen is Dr. Fricker saying to another board member, well, so-and-so wants a gym, and so-and-so wants special ed, and so-and, you know, to where all of a sudden the decision and deliberation is happening through the superintendent. So that's what we're, again, worried about. Receipt of written legal advice is not a meeting. That's actually been an issue. The question of a memo received from legal counsel to the whole board is somehow created a meeting. No. The meeting might happen if you say, oh, I got this crazy memo from Sue Ann, and what do you think about it, right? Then you're deliberating. I would never send you a crazy memo.
Sue Ann?
Yes.
Can a response be from any intermediate or from the superintendent, say, you know what, that's something that I've heard from other, you know, others of the same concern, we're planning to put this on the agenda.
Yes.
That's okay, right?
Yes, exactly, exactly. You need to be able to work with the administration, right? To identify issues that you as an individual board member believe are important for the full board to address. So that's how you would communicate that. You can also speak to your board president about that. So those are appropriate for sure. And part of being an engaged board member, right? You don't just sit back and react to what somebody else decides should be on the agenda. You're participating in that too. So board member protocols, we want to stay informed. We want to be really well prepared for our meetings, but we don't have a serial meeting. What can I do? What can't I do? So I received a report on that building, and it's before the meeting. Is that a problem since all the board got it? No, not at all. In fact, that's really nice that you got it in advance, because then you can have a chance to review it before you're called to deliberate, discuss, and maybe take action, right? So you all receive it. When does the public get it? Well, we're going to assume this is not a privileged document. This is something that will be available to the public. It becomes available, an option for the public to receive when it is delivered to a majority of the board. So at that point, somebody can say, I heard that a majority of the board got this report, and I want a copy. Sure. And now with board docs, and we're posting so much more documents that will be considered by the board at the meeting that it's much easier to deal with that. Have them check the website. Everything's on the website. You can meet with staff before the board meeting. We just talked about that. You can, I know that building's going to be on the agenda, or it's already on the agenda. I want to talk to Dr. Fricker and get some more information that I'm curious about. And I'd like her to bring forward to the full board at the meeting this information, this information, and this information. Right. Right. That's actually efficient, isn't it? Right? Instead of getting to the meeting and then conferring and saying, but I really want to see X additional information, right? So perfectly appropriate. But we talked about the do's and don'ts, right? You don't then call the other board members and say, hey, I asked for this additional information. Just keep your communications where they're originally directed, right? That's sort of the bottom line. So how many of you have a blog? No bloggers. Blogging is even kind of out now, right? I mean, that's a little passé. But the idea is that you want to post information to your constituents. You may have your own website. You may have something that you use to post relevant information. Can you put stuff on your website or your blog, even if you know that your other board members can see it? What do you think? Sure. Yes. You are free to express. What you can't do then is have the communications and discussions around it. And if your other board members say, hey, I saw this on your website, and I totally disagree, and then another one says, yeah, but that's a good point, what do? All of a sudden, on the web, on your blog, is a discussion that violates the Brown Act. So we talked about common scenarios, attending the other public agency meetings. You can do that. Conferences, CSBA. What other big conferences do you, as a board, participate in?
Governance.
What is it?
Go to the big training.
Oh yeah, the governance training, and that's even more condensed, right? And I could see you saying, you're all there, you're all trying to learn, and you have your individual issues that your district faces, and you want to talk about that. So that's appropriate, so long as, again, you're not discussing and getting into the minds of your other board members. You're just asking for information and education on a particular issue. And then information from staff, your Friday memo, not a meeting, even though you're all getting that information, and you will discuss most, if not all of it, at your agendized meeting, next agendized meeting. But just receiving the information doesn't do anything to trigger a meeting. Agenda requirements. So this is one of those things that, honestly, at 25 years, I'm still looking to make sure the language is right for what the situation is. And it truly is case by case. Because you can have a situation that seems very much like an employee discipline dismissal, but it's not, right? There are a few recent developments, and we'll cover those on the question of superintendent or high-level, what we call executive contracts and how those are handled. But it's a very important area, even though it probably feels a little kind of clerical boring. Because if there's a mistake, the impacts, at least as the law sees them, are significant. And it can void the action you've taken, it can subject the board to litigation or DA review, and we just don't want any of that. So we're conscientious about our agenda. They have to be posted in a location that is freely accessible and searchable on the website to members of the public. So that's fairly new. The website piece has only been in the last few years. For a regular meeting, it's 72 hours before the meeting. And then if it's a special meeting, it's 24 hours. Now, we'll talk about what happens when you, oops, forgot this really